most dangerous people in your life rarely arrive as enemies. They arrive as familiar faces, trusted voices, people with history, people with access. Sometimes they arrive as family. And that is exactly why Sophia Empaths struggle to recognize certain behaviors for what they truly are. Because empathy changes perception. The Sophia Empath naturally searches for reasons behind anger, reasons behind manipulation, reasons behind cruelty, reasons behind emotional inconsistency. And the more they understand someone's pain, the easier it becomes to tolerate behavior that should never have been tolerated. That is the trap. Carl Jung understood something uncomfortable about human nature. Understanding a person's wounds does not protect you from the wounds they create. Yet many Sophia Empaths spend years believing it does. They tell themselves they've been through a lot. They don't mean it. They're struggling. They'll change eventually. And sometimes those things are true. But truth can become dangerous when it turns into an excuse. Because every behavior tolerated repeatedly teaches people something. It teaches them what they can get away with. Kindness without boundaries quietly teaches people how to use you. The Sophia Empath often learns this too late. Not because they are weak, because they see humanity where others see behavior. And while that makes them compassionate, it also makes them vulnerable. Especially inside families. Especially inside relationships built on guilt, obligation, history. Because history creates emotional blindness. People assume that love automatically makes behavior acceptable, that family automatically deserves unlimited access, that loyalty means enduring whatever someone chooses to do. But awareness eventually destroys those illusions, and awareness is exactly where this journey begins. The Sophia Empath starts noticing a disturbing pattern. The people who hurt the most are often the same people demanding the most understanding. The people who create chaos are often the same people demanding loyalty. The people who refuse accountability are often the same people demanding forgiveness. Different faces, same pattern. And that pattern leads to a realization most empaths spend years avoiding. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to your empathy. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to your patience. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to you, especially when their behavior repeatedly destroys the very thing they expect you to keep giving. And the first behavior Sophia Empaths must never tolerate begins there. Not with hatred, not with betrayal, but with something far more subtle. Emotional manipulation disguised as love. Emotional manipulation rarely looks like manipulation. That is why it works. If it arrived wearing its true face, most people would recognize it immediately, but it doesn't. It arrives disguised as concern, disguised as sacrifice, disguised as love. And the Sophia Empath is often the perfect target because they care deeply, and anyone who cares deeply can be controlled through that care. At first, the manipulation seems small, a subtle guilt trip, a disappointed tone, an emotional withdrawal whenever boundaries appear. Nothing obvious, nothing dramatic, just enough discomfort to make the empath question themselves. Carl Jung believed that unconscious people rarely manipulate intentionally. Many simply repeat patterns they learned long ago, patterns built around control, fear, dependency, emotional survival. That is what makes this behavior so difficult to recognize, because the manipulator often believes their own story. The parent who uses guilt to maintain influence, the partner who uses sadness to avoid accountability, the family member who makes every boundary feel like betrayal. Different people, same mechanism, emotional pressure. And emotional pressure becomes dangerous when it is confused with love. The Sophia Empath often spends years making that mistake because they assume love should feel responsible, obligated, sacrificial. But eventually, a darker realization begins emerging. Love does not demand your freedom in exchange for acceptance. Control does. Love does not punish boundaries. Control does. Love does not make you feel guilty for protecting your peace. Control does. People don't always ask for your loyalty. Sometimes they demand it emotionally, without ever saying the words. And that is where manipulation becomes invisible, because the request is never spoken, only implied. The Sophia Empath begins noticing how often certain relationships operate this way. The moment they say no, someone becomes wounded. The moment they create distance, someone becomes offended. The moment they choose themselves, someone suddenly becomes a victim. That pattern matters more than most people realize, because healthy love survives boundaries. Manipulation does not. Manipulation needs unlimited access, unlimited influence, unlimited emotional permission. And the moment those things disappear, the relationship begins changing. Most relationships don't end when respect disappears. They end when awareness appears. And awareness is exactly what the Sophia Empath is beginning to develop. For the first time, they stop asking, why are they upset? And start asking, why does my boundary create so much discomfort in the first place? That question reveals more than years of explanations ever could, and it leads directly into the second behavior, the behavior that quietly destroys more empaths than almost anything else. Chronic disrespect disguised as familiarity. Chronic disrespect rarely begins as obvious disrespect. That is what makes it dangerous. Nobody wakes up one morning and suddenly accepts being treated poorly. It happens gradually. One dismissive comment, one ignored boundary, one moment of humiliation disguised as humor, then another, and another, until eventually the behavior becomes normal. Not because it is acceptable, because it became familiar. And familiarity is one of the most powerful psychological forces in human life. Carl Jung understood that people adapt to environments long before they question them, especially environments tied to family, history, identity. The Sophia Empath often experiences this deeply because they naturally search for a meaning behind behavior. Someone speaks disrespectfully. The empath searches for stress. Someone constantly invalidates them. The empath searches for insecurity. Someone repeatedly crosses boundaries. The empath searches for emotional wounds. And while they are busy understanding the behavior, they forget to evaluate it. That is where the damage begins. Because repeated disrespect slowly changes self-perception. Not immediately, quietly. The person being disrespected begins adapting, lowering expectations, accepting treatment they would never accept for someone they love, making excuses for behavior they would instantly recognize elsewhere. That is the psychological trap. People often think disrespect damages relationships, but chronic disrespect damages identity, because identity is shaped by repeated experiences, repeated messages, repeated treatment. The Sophia Empath begins noticing a painful pattern. Certain people only respect boundaries they personally benefit from. Certain people only respect feelings when those feelings belong to them. Certain people only value kindness when they are receiving it. Different personalities, same pattern, entitlement. And entitlement always grows when it is tolerated. If people reveal their relationship with you through repetition, not promises, not intentions, repetition. The family member who constantly mocks your growth. The friend who disguises criticism as honesty. The partner who treats understanding as an obligation instead of a gift. These moments seem small individually, but patterns are never small. Patterns become reality. People don't always lose respect because they dislike you. Sometimes they lose respect because you taught them they could. That realization is painful because it forces the Sophia Empath to confront something uncomfortable. Empathy without standards creates access, not respect. And access without respect eventually becomes exploitation. The moment the empath understands this, something changes. The behavior no longer feels normal. The excuses stop working. The history stops justifying the pattern. And awareness begins replacing tolerance. Because familiarity is not a reason to accept disrespect, even when it comes from people you love. Especially when it comes from people you love. And the third behavior Sophia Empaths must never tolerate is even more destructive, because it attacks something deeper than respect. It attacks reality itself. Gaslighting disguised as concern. Gaslighting is one of the most destructive behaviors a Sophia Empath can experience. Not because it attacks emotions, because it attacks perception. And once perception becomes unstable, everything else becomes easier to control. The frightening thing about gaslighting is that it rarely begins with obvious lies. It begins with doubt, small doubt, subtle doubt, the kind that slowly enters your mind and refuses to leave. That never happened. You're too sensitive. You're overreacting. You're imagining things. You always take things the wrong way. Individually, these statements seem harmless, but repeated often enough, they begin reshaping reality itself. Carl Jung believed that consciousness depends on one's ability to confront reality honestly. Gaslighting does the opposite. It creates confusion. Confusion creates dependency, and dependency creates control. That is why gaslighting is so dangerous, especially for Sophia Empaths, because empaths naturally question themselves before questioning others. They assume they may have misunderstood, assume they may have missed something, assume there may be another explanation, and that humility becomes a weapon in the wrong hands. The gaslighter does not need to prove you are wrong. They only need to make you uncertain. Uncertainty is enough, because an uncertain person becomes easier to influence, easier to manipulate, easier to control. The Sophia Empath often notices something feels wrong long before they understand why. A conversation leaves them confused. An argument leaves them questioning their memory. A situation leaves them apologizing for things they never actually did. And over time, a disturbing pattern emerges. They stop trusting themselves. That is the real damage, not the lie, the loss of self-trust. Because once a person loses trust in their own perception, they begin relying on someone else's version of reality. And that is where power shifts. The family member who constantly rewrites history, the partner who denies obvious behavior, the friend who makes every concern seem irrational. Different people, same mechanism, reality distortion. People often think manipulation begins when someone controls your choices, but manipulation begins much earlier. It begins when someone controls your interpretation of reality. The Sophia Empath eventually learns a difficult truth. People who genuinely care about you may disagree with your perspective, but they do not systematically erase it. Healthy people seek clarity. Manipulative people seek confusion. That distinction changes everything. Because once confusion becomes a pattern, it is no longer a misunderstanding. It is a strategy. And awareness begins where confusion ends. The fourth behavior Sophia Empaths must never tolerate is even more common, because it hides behind one word most people automatically trust: family. Family is one of the most powerful words in the human psychology, because the moment people hear it, critical thinking often disappears. Boundaries disappear, standards disappear, and behaviors that would never be tolerated from strangers suddenly become acceptable. The Sophia Empath experiences this more than most, because empathy and family create a dangerous combination. History. Shared history makes behavior harder to evaluate objectively. Carl Jung understood that familiarity creates blindness. The longer a pattern exists, the more normal it begins to feel. Even when it is unhealthy, even when it is destructive, even when it is quietly destroying you. That is why some of the deepest wounds Sophia Empaths carry come from people they were taught they could never question. The family member who constantly criticizes, the relative who uses guilt as influence, the parent who demands loyalty while refusing accountability, the sibling who treats your kindness as weakness. Different relationships, same pattern. Emotional entitlement. And emotional entitlement grows strongest inside families, because entitlement depends on access, and family often assumes permanent access, permanent forgiveness, permanent understanding, permanent tolerance. The Sophia Empath begins hearing the same message repeatedly. That's just how they are. They didn't mean it. You should let it go. Family is family. At first, those words sound reasonable, until a darker realization appears. Excusing behavior does not change behavior. Normalizing dysfunction does not heal dysfunction. And blood does not transform toxicity into love. People often confuse connection with obligation, but they are not the same thing. Connection is earned repeatedly. Obligation is assumed automatically. The Sophia Empath eventually notices something painful. Many people use family as a shield against accountability, a shield against consequences, a shield against self-reflection, because questioning behavior feels easier than questioning identity, and family becomes part of identity. That is why awareness feels so threatening. The moment the empath starts recognizing unhealthy patterns, resistance appears, guilt appears, pressure appears, because systems built on unhealthy dynamics depend on participation. The moment one person becomes conscious, the system becomes unstable. People don't always resist your boundaries. Sometimes they resist the loss of access those boundaries create. That realization changes everything, because the Sophia empath finally understands something most people learn too late. Being family explains behavior. It does not excuse behavior, and the moment that distinction becomes clear, another illusion begins collapsing. The illusion that loyalty means self-sacrifice. Because the fifth behavior Sophia empaths must never tolerate is one they often mistake for love itself: conditional loyalty. Conditional loyalty is one of the most painful behaviors a Sophia empath can encounter, because it pretends to be loyalty. At first, everything feels normal. Support exists, affection exists, connection exists, until one thing changes. You disagree. You create a boundary. You choose yourself. And suddenly, the loyalty disappears. That is when the truth reveals itself. Because real loyalty survives the disagreement. Conditional loyalty survives compliance. There is a difference. A massive difference. Carl Jung believed that people often confuse attachment with love. The Sophia empath eventually discovers they also confuse attachment with loyalty. Someone supports them as long as they remain useful. Someone stands beside them as long as they remain obedient. Someone loves them as long as they remain predictable. And the moment that predictability disappears, so does the relationship. That pattern is everywhere. The friend who becomes distant when you stop solving their problems. The family member who becomes hostile when you stop accepting disrespect. The partner who withdraws affection when you stop giving them control. Different people, same mechanism, conditional acceptance. And conditional acceptance creates a dangerous illusion. It teaches people that love must be earned repeatedly, that belonging depends on performance, that connection depends on sacrifice. The Sophia empath often grows up believing exactly this, because they were rewarded for understanding others, rewarded for patience, rewarded for self-sacrifice, rewarded for carrying emotional burdens that were never theirs, until eventually they begin mistaking exhaustion for love. People don't always abandon you when you fail them. Sometimes they abandon you when you stop abandoning yourself. That realization feels brutal, because it exposes the foundation of many relationships. Not mutual respect, access, not connection, convenience, not loyalty, dependency. The Sophia empath begins noticing something disturbing. Certain people only remain close while receiving benefits. The moment reciprocity is required, distance appears. The moment accountability appears, distance appears. The moment self-respect appears, distance appears. And that distance reveals everything, because genuine loyalty becomes stronger when boundaries appear. False loyalty disappears. That is why awareness changes relationships. Not because awareness is cruel, because awareness exposes conditions that were hidden all along. And once the Sophia empath sees those conditions clearly, they can never fully unsee them. The sixth behavior Sophia empaths must never tolerate attacks something even deeper than loyalty: the constant invalidation of their emotional reality. The constant invalidation of your emotions does not always look abusive. Sometimes it looks reasonable. That is what makes it dangerous. Because if someone openly attacked your feelings every day, you would recognize it. You would see the pattern. You would protect yourself. But invalidation rarely arrives honestly. It arrives disguised as logic, disguised as advice, disguised as concern. You're too emotional. You're taking it personally. You're making a big deal out of nothing. You're overthinking again. At first, these phrases seem harmless, even helpful, until they become a pattern. And patterns always matter more than individual moments. Carl Jung believed that emotions contain information, not always perfect information, but information nonetheless. The Sophia Empath understands this instinctively because emotions often reveal truths before logic catches up. A feeling of discomfort, a feeling of unease, a feeling that something is wrong beneath the surface. And yet, many empaths spend years surrounded by people who teach them to distrust those signals, to suppress them, to ignore them, to explain them away. That is where the damage begins. Because the more a person ignores their emotional reality, the more disconnected they become from themselves. The Sophia Empath starts noticing something strange. Every time they express concern, someone minimizes it. Every time they express hurt, someone rationalizes it. Every time they express a boundary, someone reframes it as an overreaction. Different conversations, same outcome, self-doubt. And self-doubt is one of the most effective forms of control, because a person who questions their own feelings becomes easier to influence, easier to redirect, easier to silence. The family member who mocks sensitivity, the partner who dismisses concerns, the friend who treats every emotional reaction as weakness. Different people, same behavior, emotional invalidation. People often think emotional harm comes from insults, but emotional harm often comes from something quieter. Being repeatedly taught that your inner experience is not trustworthy, that your feelings are wrong, that your perceptions are exaggerated, that your instincts cannot be believed. And eventually, the Sophia Empath begins realizing something powerful. Their emotions were never the problem. The problem was being surrounded by people who benefited from them ignoring those emotions. Because awareness begins where self-trust returns. The moment the empath starts trusting their own emotional reality again, certain relationships immediately become uncomfortable. Not because the empath changed, because the old dynamics stopped working. And that leads directly into the seventh behavior, a behavior that slowly drains the life out of even the strongest empath. Being treated as an emotional resource instead of a human being. Being treated as an emotional resource is one of the most invisible forms of exploitation, because it often feels like love. At first, people come to you with problems, pain, confusion, heartbreak, fear, and the Sophia Empath listens. That is what they do. They listen, they understand, they absorb, they carry, and for a while, it feels meaningful. It feels like connection. It feels like purpose, until a disturbing pattern begins appearing. The relationship only becomes active when someone needs something. Your phone rings when there is a crisis. Your messages arrive when there is emotional chaos. Your presence becomes valuable when someone needs comfort. But when your life begins falling apart, silence appears. Carl Jung understood something many empaths struggle to accept. People often confuse access with intimacy. Just because someone shares their pain with you does not mean they truly care about yours. That realization is devastating, because the Sophia Empath often measures connection through emotional depth. If someone reveals their wounds, the empath assumes trust exists, reciprocity exists, care exists. But sometimes, none of those things exist. Sometimes people are not connecting. They are unloading. There is a difference, a massive difference. The empath begins noticing it everywhere. The friend who calls only when they need support. The partner who expects understanding but rarely offers it. The family member who treats your emotional energy as an unlimited resource. Different relationships, same pattern. Consumption. People take and take and take while calling it connection. That is why emotional exhaustion becomes so common among Sophia Empaths. Not because they care too much, because too many people care too little. People don't always value your empathy. Sometimes they simply become dependent on it. And dependency creates entitlement. The entitlement to your time, your patience, your attention, your emotional labor, without ever asking what it cost you. That is the darkest part, because emotional exhaustion rarely arrives dramatically. It accumulates quietly, one conversation at a time, one sacrifice at a time, one ignored need at a time, until eventually, the empath begins feeling empty around the very people they once felt closest to. And that emptiness reveals something painful. A relationship built entirely around what you provide was never truly built around you. That realization changes everything. Because once the Sophia Empath sees the difference between being loved and being used, they can never fully return to who they were before. And the eighth behavior they must never tolerate is even more dangerous, because it destroys growth itself. Punishment for becoming stronger. Punishment for becoming stronger is one of the clearest signs of an unhealthy relationship. Yet the Sophia Empath often recognizes it last, because growth is supposed to be celebrated. At least that is what people say. They say they want you to heal, want you to become confident, want you to know your worth, want you to grow, until growth changes your behavior. Then something strange happens. The same people who encourage your growth begin resisting its consequences. Carl Jung understood that human beings often prefer familiar versions of people, because familiarity feels safe, predictable, controllable. Growth destroys predictability, and predictability is what many unhealthy relationships secretly depend on. The Sophia Empath begins noticing this pattern. When they had weak boundaries, people felt comfortable. When they constantly sacrificed themselves, people felt comfortable. When they ignored disrespect, people felt comfortable. But the moment self-respect appears, resistance appears. The moment boundaries appear, resistance appears. The moment confidence appears, resistance appears. Different people, same reaction. Because growth changes access. People don't resent your weakness. They resent the possibility that you might outgrow them. That is why punishment often appears indirectly. Not through honesty, through criticism, mockery, distance, passive aggression, unexpected hostility. The family member who suddenly calls you selfish. The friend who suddenly accuses you of changing. The partner who suddenly misses the old you. The old you. The version that tolerated everything. The version that accepted less. The version that remained small enough to keep everyone comfortable. That is the version they miss, not necessarily you. And that realization feels brutal, because it exposes something many Sophia Empaths never wanted to believe. Some people love your wounds more than your healing, because wounded people are easier to influence, easier to predict, easier to keep in place. The Sophia Empath eventually realizes that genuine love celebrates growth, even when growth creates distance, even when growth changes the relationship, even when growth removes unhealthy dynamics. False love does the opposite. It punishes evolution. It rewards stagnation. It demands familiarity over authenticity. And once the empath recognizes this pattern, their entire perception changes, because they finally understand something most people learn too late. Not everyone who supports your pain will support your transformation. And the ninth and final behavior Sophia Empaths must never tolerate is the most dangerous of all, because it destroys every behavior that came before it. The demand that you betray yourself to keep others comfortable,